Now, in this course section, we again learned a lot of important new things. And as we learned new things, this app.js file, which contains our Node Express code, got bigger and bigger. It's still not large, but it grew quite a bit. And this overall is a simple page. It's probably easy to imagine that if you're building more complex websites, this gets even more complex and bigger. And hence, as a developer, you typically wanna split your code into multiple smaller pieces, which are then each a bit easier to handle and maintain. And that's what we did with our templates already. Restaurant item is a small, manageable piece of HTML, for example, which is then combined with other parts of this page. And what we also did before with CSS, where we split our code across multiple files. And we typically want to do the same for our backend code. And a good example here for splitting our code a little bit and for also extracting some reused functionality into a utility function would be this code where I access my stored restaurants. Because we have the same code here in the recommend route, and then also here in the restaurant's detail route for a specific ID, and then also here in that get route where we get all the restaurants. So we have the same kind of code in different routes. And such duplication is typically something you wanna avoid. Because if I ever have to change something about that, if I have to change the way we built this path, I have to do it in 3 places. Hence, what you typically would do in such a scenario is you would create a brand new function which contains this code, which then could be called from all these different routes. Now that is what we will do. But I also mentioned that we want to split our code across files to keep our files maintainable. And therefore I'll do both things in one go here. I'll add a new subfolder here, which I'll name util for utility. This is absolutely not a name you have to use. Instead, that's just a name I will use here to put all my utility backend code into this folder. So that I have a folder with the public files, which are shared statically, that I have a folder for my templates, that I have a folder for my data, and now I also have a folder with some utility functions that I use in my backend code. And in there, I'll add my restaurant-file.js file, because this JavaScript file should hold the code for working with that restaurant data file. Maybe we therefore name it restaurant data, now that I think about it. And in this restaurant data.js file, I'll add a function which I'll name getStoredRestaurants. Because that is what this piece of code, which I want to reuse, does. It gets me this list of stored restaurants by reading that restaurants JSON file. So now I'll copy that here, that code snippet, which we are repeating so often, and I'll add that here in getStoredRestaurants. Here, I now just want to return those stored restaurants then, so that I don't just have them available in this function, but also in any function that calls this function here. Because that's the idea behind getStoredRestaurants. I am creating the standalone function with this shared functionality so that different places in my Express app can call this function and can get the stored restaurants which I'm retrieving here. But for that to happen, I need to make them accessible outside of this function as well, and that is what we do by returning them. Now in app.js, for example here in the recommend route, if I need my stored restaurants, and I do need them because I work with them here, I have to use this function, this getStoredRestaurants function here, and then store the value that is returned by that function, which is that array of restaurants, in the stored restaurants here. So here in the recommend route, I can now add stored restaurants, and then call getStoredRestaurants like this, and that should then return me this stored restaurants array. Now it can be confusing that I have stored restaurants here in this function and also here as a name, but that's only a coincidence here, or well, we have that name for historic reasons because this code here in getStoredRestaurants was in this place a couple of seconds ago, but we can now also rename this, for example, to just restaurants. Like that, in all the places where I was using stored restaurants here. Now I did rename it to just restaurants, and that's now the data which I'm getting with help of my utility function. But this code like that would not work. And why would it not work? For a couple of reasons actually. For one, just using the function name like this, if the function is stored in a different file, would fail. We'll fix this later. It would also not work though, because I'm then trying to write back into this file, which is stored in this file path. But file path previously was a constant in this route function. It isn't anymore. File path is now actually a constant in getStoredRestaurants. And you learned earlier in the course already when we had a look at the basics of JavaScript in the browser. And it's the same here because, as you learned, Node.js JavaScript generally works just like browser-side JavaScript. There you learned that if you have a variable that is defined in a function, it's not by default available in other parts of your code. So in this app.js function here, I can't just use file path. It is defined in this getStoredRestaurants function, but it's basically also captured in there. You don't have access to it in other places. Now, a good way of solving this would be to simply add another utility function in this restaurant.data.js file in the util folder. And this utility function stores our restaurants back into this file. So here we could name this store restaurants like this. And I would expect that I get the restaurants that should be stored as a parameter. So here I get my restaurants or the storable restaurants, however you want to name this. And then in there, inside of this helper function, we then reach out to the file to store our data. So we copy this line of code, write file sync, and add that here in store restaurants. With that, we still don't have access to the file path because that's still in a different function. But what we could do now is we could just move that out of getStoredRestaurants and turn this into a constant which is available in this file as a whole. And if you do that, this will actually be accessible by all the functions in this file. Not in other files, I can say that, but all the functions of this file. And therefore, file path now is available here in getStoredRestaurants, but also here in store restaurants. And in store restaurants, I now just want to make sure that I store my storable restaurants like this. Now we outsourced both the read file and write file functionality into separate functions that have some extra functionality inside of them in this utility file. Now in app.js, where I want to write to this file, I can just call store restaurants and pass my updated restaurants, which is this restaurants array to which I pushed a new restaurant, to store restaurants. Because store restaurants, this function which we just added, does have this storable restaurants parameter, which is that value that it wants to then store it in our file. So we should make sure that we pass a value for this parameter here. And I know that these were a lot of steps and we did move quite a bit of code around, but refactoring code like this is a common task to avoid code duplication and to keep your individual code snippets short, concise, and maintainable. That's why I'm doing this. Still, unfortunately, we're still not there. This code would fail. And I'll tell you why, and we'll fix it in the next lecture.